Hey everyone, I'm Patrick Jones, and welcome to episode 65 of That Gives Me Anxiety. Whispering a little bit, I guess. Shout whispering probably describes it better. But I'm a little sleepy. Family was here this past weekend, which was incredible. It was so nice to show them our house and have some fun and spend some time together. But of course, now I'm tired. I cooked a lot. I've gotten really into cooking since the pandemic. I mean, if you lose the commute, which, I work from home, it gives you a little bit more time to put some more effort into what you're cooking. And it's something I really enjoy. In fact, Jamie described it as food is now my love language. But I think it describes it well, right? Like if you're making a big meal for someone that requires all these extra steps, you're doing it out of love. I mean, you don't blanch the asparagus before you cook it because you hate the person. Which, if you're not blanching your asparagus and broccoli, do it. You also went downtown and I did a show at Theater 99 for them. It was one of the things that I was describing as, the weird thing giving me anxiety last week. But it was such a good show. Everything worked out and it was nice to have them come see. And yeah, nothing to be worried about. We have nothing to worry about except worrying itself. Patrick Jones. So I've got a great episode lined up. Certainly a heavier topic, but unfortunately, mass violence does not seem to be ending anytime soon. I mean, my goodness, there's been so many already in 2023. And I interviewed Dr. Alyssa Rheingold, who's a professor and clinical psychologist, among other things. She works at the National Mass Violence and Victimization Resource Center and is affiliated with the Medical University of South Carolina. Her group studies and helps locations sort of get their bearings about what they need to help the mental health aspects whenever there's a mass shooting. Because there's, as she describes, there's a ripple effect that beyond the people who are directly impacted, right? They were present, but there's a ripple effect of the community learning of such atrocities, right? It affects you. So although we wish that these incidents would not happen, it's nice to know that there's larger groups that are able to come in and help and do what we can, right? But before we get to the interview, I just want to remind you of my other podcast called Death Space Filling the Void. Check it out wherever you get your podcasts. If you're liking the show, please remember to rate and review it. 5 stars. Add a little blurb in there. That really helps boost the show in the algorithm. You can check the show out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, or YouTube. YouTube is where you can see how tired I actually look. What fun that would be. Then there's the Pure Spectrum, which is a CBD company that I've partnered with, who have the promo code AnxietyPod for 15% off. And if you're liking the show and you want to make a donation or consider it a tip, you can do that through the Buy Me a Coffee link. It's in the description wherever you're listening. So yes, certainly just another reminder, this is about mass violence. So as you get to the interview, if it feels like it's becoming overwhelming, pause it, reach out to somebody. If it is overwhelming, just take care of yourself. So as always, thank you so much for listening and enjoy. Joining me now on the podcast, I have Alyssa Rheingold, who's a professor at the Medical University of South Carolina and the director of the Preparedness and Response Division at the National Mass Violence Victimization Resource Center. Did I get that correctly?
Yes, you did. It's a mouthful.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Well, this interview came about when I read an article that you were interviewed for in Charleston's newspaper. For people who are outside Charleston, the Post and Courier. I'm nervous to have this conversation, but also excited that people are on top of it in terms of mass violence. I mean, how did you get into the field?
Well, so I'm a clinical psychologist. I do research and clinical work and teaching in the area of trauma predominantly. I work at the Medical University of South Carolina in a division called the National Mass, it's called the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center. And we house the Mass Violence Center. Initially started doing work with folks who've lost loved ones to homicide, so survivors of homicide, traumatic grief work. And that's really one of my areas of specialty, really very underserved population, and had done a lot of outreach and support group work with our local sheriff's office and, providing specialized care for that population. And our center as a whole have done a lot of research over the years in different types of traumatic events, mass violence being one of them. Some of our colleagues did some research with the Lockerbie crash bombings and some other sort of large scale events, 9/11. And then here in Charleston in 2015, we experienced our own mass violence incident where a white supremacist went into Mother Emanuel AME Church and shot and killed 9 parishioners when they were praying during Bible study. And our center sort of got thrust into assisting with that immediate response and assisting with the ongoing recovery efforts. And that sort of, my already area of specialty with working with survivors of homicide and traumatic loss sort of lended itself to be able to kind of assist. And then through there, we then began to connect with other communities that have experienced mass violence incidents to both learn sort of lessons learned and figure out what we can do to best help support each other. And then ended up getting some funding through the Office of Victims of Crime to be able to create the National Mass Violence Victimization Resource Center. So for me, it's sort of a path that sort of, I guess, led
Once you
from
hear
one
the dots,
experience to
it
next.
makes
Yes,
sense. Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
Exactly.
So it's basically part research and part support.
Yes. So
Yeah.
I kind of feel like the research I do informs clinically what I do.
Mhm.
And then clinically, working directly with victims and survivors is going to inform, figuring out what we need to know to better help people. So I look at it as, they're both equally important. And as well as getting, figuring out how to disseminate that information. I'm very interested in figuring out what works, why it works, and how we can teach others what
That's
works
great.
best.
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing in any scientific discipline to understand something, but being able to communicate it to the general public is, I mean, that leads to acceptance, right? When everyone can sort of understand what you're saying, and that's a big part of it. So that's awesome. I'm curious about, what have you learned about mass violence? Is there any sort of through line about what people may need after, or yeah, I'm just curious about your research.
Sure. Well, there's there's lots of answers to that of what people need. It's just such a complex issue. We do know from kind of the work that we've been doing that it's sort of a ripple effect. So clearly the people that are most impacted are those that have lost loved ones in that type of event, those that were physically injured, that witnessed, that were present during those incidents. But it definitely is a ripple effect. So we know that communities at large can be impacted, not just as direct victims, but those within those overall communities. And then we also know that when it's a hate-based type of mass violence incident, right, it not only impacts that community at hand, but then it includes that whole population of people that are tied to, that group of individuals that were targeted. And so it impacts more than just those in that room. It really can impact lots of people for a long time as well. We also know that, on the flip side, that people are resilient. And so we know humans, we're resilient. And so not everybody is going to be completely altered, and have chronic problems for the rest of their life. The majority of people won't, but we do know that there are some that are at risk for ongoing difficulties, and that for those individuals it can be lifelong and chronic if they don't get some intervention or assistance.
Right. I definitely understand the ripple effect. I mean, I'm from New York, and my dad lived or was in 9/11. He was there during the day, and thankfully was able to get out. And I've felt the ripple effect of that throughout my life. And I mean, I count my blessings that he came home, right? But it certainly could have been worse. And also, a particular mass shooting really stays with me, and that is
the Aurora, Colorado, where the guy dressed up like the Joker and
Mhm.
the movie theater. And I I can't go to the movies without thinking of it. I know that's on like the
Mhm.
lower end of, anxiety, and anxiety can really get a lot worse than that. But the fact that that enters my mind
Yep.
every time is crazy. I'll even say that to myself. Like, I can't believe that I'm
Right.
still thinking about this.
Yep. That is a great example of just that ripple effect, how it impacts, like, it's infused nationally. In 2015, there was a Gallup poll that asked about U.S. citizens, their fear of a mass violence incident, and half of U.S. citizens in 2019 reported that they feared being a victim of mass violence incident. Half of Americans, right? That was in 2019. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, I'm wondering what would be like now. Like, I'm wondering if it actually would be higher. And I think it infuses in a lot of people that worry and fear. Interestingly, the likelihood that you're going to be a victim of a mass violence, even though it is definitely have increased significantly. We see it in the news all the time. It is a huge issue and it impacts communities at large. The likelihood that you will be a direct victim is you're more likely to be the direct victim of another type of violent crime than a mass violence incident, but people don't usually worry about those as
Mhm.
much. But yeah, it is, I think about it when I drop my kids off at school sometimes, and when I go to, my place of worship. And so I think that's that example of how it just has that ripple effect and it impacts people in different ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. Bringing up the news, it's become like a runaway train where I think news organizations want to, they understand the ratings bump of a shooting, right? And
Hmm.
not to boil it down or dehumanize the actual loss of life to news ratings, but I feel like it's getting covered more and more often, which keeps it on the forefront of our minds. And that weight, it just begins to feel like it's omnipresent. It's happening every day. And I guess in some cases it is, but it's
Yeah.
good to hear how unlikely it is to happen too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely increased significantly over time, but yeah, I think the media makes it ever present. We have more accessible to the news across the country more now than ever, and so it's there, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. We tend to see that feed over and over again, and that can also impact us and how we function.
Yeah. Can we talk? I know you've got a lot on your plate. You've got work, you've got friends, you've got family, pets, you've got the people that you make small talk with at the coffee shop or gym. You've got that bird that you see when you wake up every morning outside your window that you've projected things onto. Look at that bird. Doesn't even love its family, it's always by itself. You do that. Everyone does that. Point is, you've got a lot on your plate. Well, that's why there's Instacart, to take a little bit off your plate. Using Instacart, you search for all your favorite foods and things that you need from the grocery store, all online, all while you're looking at that bird, wondering why it hasn't called its mom. And they deliver it to you. They go to the store and do the shopping for you. And they can deliver it in as fast as an hour. And you can sign up by clicking the link in the description, wherever you're listening or watching. And that's a great way of supporting the show. So it's a great way of supporting this show. It's a great way to make your life a little bit easier because we all know that you have so much going on, like wondering whether that bird judges you back. So, how do we start to unpack this? I mean, you're talking about the ripple effects really affect everybody, but does your work, you focus more on the direct or the families of people who were directly affected, or do you go after the ripple as well?
Well, our work at our center, I mean, here in Charleston, we worked directly after the Mother Emanuel and Amy church shooting. We work directly with victims, but our mass violence center, really, we don't actually. We're not deployed and go out and work with direct victims. Our role is really to support those communities. So we do a lot of consultation with impacted communities, to help them tend to their community, their victim and survivor needs. We, work with, often after a mass violence incident, a community might establish a resiliency center, for instance, as a hub for places to go to get resources. So we help those resiliency centers provide support in helping them figure out how to set that up, what's best practice, help support them along the way. We do some training on early intervention techniques that folks can do with victims and survivors, on treatment interventions. So our role is really to kind of train and support these communities for the gamut, for both the focusing on how to identify and react and outreach to your direct victims and indirect victims, and then also how to provide comprehensive care for your whole community.
That's
It's
great.
kind of really what our role is.
Yeah. I mean, I'd imagine when these things happen, sometimes it's in smaller communities that may not understand or have the resources that a larger city has, and they may be like still processing it themselves while also thrust into the situation. So it's great that you're there to support them and show them a way. What are some things that you teach people to do and set up?
Well, we really try to lean on some evidence-informed sort of best practice, what we know from the trauma and disaster field. So, for instance, shortly after 9/11, when 9/11 occurred, so many people went in to kind of help victim advocates, mental health professionals, first responders, to help tend to kind of the psychological needs of everybody impacted. So many people flew in and did lots of different things. There was no standard for what to do. So some things that people did were helpful, some might not have really done anything at all, and some might actually have been harmful, inadvertently harmful. And so after 9/11, a lot of the researchers and clinicians and providers in the field from the National Center for PTSD and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network got together and said, okay, what do we know from the trauma field that can help? So they put together some materials about some early intervention approaches that we can do to help intervene. So one of the things that we try to encourage people to learn ahead of time is things like psychological first aid, what to actually do with an individual shortly after a mass violence incident, whether that's at the initial response center or family assistance center. So teaching them some skills, psychological first aid, also teaching them some, what do you do thereafter, the weeks and months thereafter, to help people foster recovery, right? Help people figure out a new normal and adapt to that distress and adversity. There's interventions such as skills for psychological recovery, which can help with that. And then we also help connect people to identify who may be trained in trauma-informed or trauma-focused evidence-based treatments in their community. We connect those communities to get those trainings if they don't have them. So we train folks on trauma-informed approaches and how to work with your community to develop a comprehensive approach that includes good outreach, includes identifying your most vulnerable populations and helping serve their needs. So sort of going off on lots of different tangents, but
so there's a lot to be done.
Lots to be done. Yes. So our focus is really a lot on the mental health aspects of victim services.
Yeah. I'm curious about how I've been doing this podcast a while. I'm not a mental health professional myself. I'm curious about the role or how anxiety can kind of spread. Someone has given me the metaphor of it like dropping ink in a container of water. It'll begin to spread out. So let's say someone is watching the news too much and seeing all these shootings and is starting to experience anxiety. Can you talk a little bit about what might be going on with them?
Well, sure. So, how we feel is very much tied to how we think and perceive the world, how we perceive ourselves and other people in the world around us, and it impacts in what we do. And so that's sort of like a feedback loop between our feelings, our thoughts, and kind of what we do. And so, and there's things in our environment that cue that or trigger that, like watching the news. I watch the news, I may have the thought, oh my gosh, the world's a dangerous place, or how do we, this is never ending, right? And then that can make me feel anxious. And then I'm feeling anxious. And then I might have the thought, oh my gosh, I'm anxious. And then I might have thoughts about that, right? And it just kind of feeds off each other. And then my behaviors might be, continue to obsessively watch perhaps more information because you don't want to miss out. And then that kind of continues that loop, or maybe I, go grab the quart of ice cream and sit on the couch and eat ice cream, whatever it may be. So they all kind of can feed off each other in those moments. And so, so there are some things that we could do to kind of stop that cycle sometimes, which I think can be helpful because it's very easy just to get caught up in it.
Yeah. When do you think it arises to the point that someone should seek help?
I think when it interferes with your day-to-day functioning in life, right? When it keeps you from doing the things you want to do in life, I think that's a good time to probably seek help. When it interferes with your sleep, perhaps, and your relationships or your school or work. So I think those are times to think, maybe someone can help me with this.
One of life's mysteries is that birthdays always find me unprepared, catch me unprepared. I don't go on Facebook as much, so I don't notice them as much. But I want to express my love and appreciation for friends and family. That wasn't part of the copy, I'm just saying it. Year after year, month after month. Even when I see it coming, I'm not ready. Am I a jerk? Yes and no. Why do things have to be so black and white for you? But I've got great news, friends. Introducing monthly card subscriptions from the Cardist studio. Join the service that delivers the card and the stamp that you'll need to your door. No more errands. Who wants more errands? I don't know why, but I'm starting to think of errands as a kid's name. Errands, go back to bed. Okay, but here's how it works. You choose your categories, from birthdays and celebrations to love and encouragement, or select their full collections and have those thank you notes and just because cards at the ready. Those ones are always so nice. Like when you get a card for doing something and it's just like a small little heads up or token of appreciation, it genuinely makes you feel really good. And best of all, you would never get caught cardless again. Let me repeat, you'll never get caught cardless again. Try to say that a bunch of times in a row. You'll never get caught cardless again. Monthly card subscriptions from as little as $8 per month for the card and the stamp. Delivered to you. TheCardistStudio.com shop subscriptions. And you can use the promo code AnxietyPod for 15% off your originating order. I'm struggling to formulate the question because I want to be sensitive to the nature of what they're going through, but how helpful or someone in their family has been a victim of a homicide. I guess plainly, I'm just going to say the question, how helpful is therapy to make them or give them the tools to help themselves? I mean, it feels such a Herculean level task to help somebody in that situation. So I'm curious what you find.
Yeah. Therapy can actually be very helpful after traumatic loss. There are some really good effective interventions out there after traumatic loss, right? That's kind of what you're meaning.
Yeah.
So it puts people at risk for, we all will grieve, and grief is a universal concept. So, that's something we all will go through at some point in our life. But traumatic loss can put you at increased risk for things like post-traumatic stress disorder. So you can, after traumatic loss, have those type of symptoms, depression, and prolonged grief disorder. And prolonged grief disorder is kind of like, to me, it's sort of like the getting stuck in that intense grief, that we may more naturally go through that process and move through in life and accepting that loss. So traumatic loss can put us at risk for having more prolonged grief. So treatment can kind of help somebody work through that. So it's not a chronic, debilitating, thing that they're stuck with, but something that they can help work through. And so you'll always have grief because you will always loved that person that died, but there are ways that you can therapeutically work through that, so you can find meaning in that loss, find meaning in life again, which is different now than it was before loss, and therapy can really help with that because sometimes people may struggle doing that on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I feel like a lot of people, myself included, struggle with the idea it's not like it's something that you're taught in school about how to grieve. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some best practices when it comes to grieving? I think a lot of people
Mhm.
say that you have to actually deal with it and not stuff it down, but I'm curious what you would say.
Yeah. I mean, I think the layperson, most people have heard of like the stages of grief, right?
Mhm.
Kubler-Ross kind of coined the 5 stages of grief. We actually don't grieve that way. That's actually not accurate. We don't go through stages. Not
Mhm.
everybody has to feel anger. We don't necessarily do
Mhm.
bargaining. So grief is sort of a constellation of a whole bunch of reactions and symptoms and thoughts and feelings and physical sensations. Most people over, and time is another kind of myth that people say, well, time will heal all.
Mhm.
And time in of itself doesn't necessarily help. It's kind of what you do with that time. And so
Mhm.
helping people, I think the things that are most helpful with grief is approaching it, not avoiding it. Often we get real distressed. We try to avoid and not think and push it away, which a little bit of distraction can be helpful when need be. Like if I'm at
Mhm.
work, I'm going to have to distract myself so I can work. But if I constantly shelve it, it's going to just keep coming back at me. And so,
Mhm.
really kind of approaching that, figuring out ways to be able to sit with that loss and grief and that sadness, but not get so sit with it that then you're like sucked into it. So, it's sort of learning how to carry it. I usually like to explain it's like carrying it light, trying to learn how to carry it more lightly, doing things that are engaging in life because life's going to be different. So figuring out how to do things differently and
Mhm.
find new things that give you new meaning and purpose, because what gave you meaning and purpose before might not now. And so trying to, figure that out, doing things in honor of your loved one. So figuring out how to engage with your loved one who's no longer here physically. So you can't have that same relationship, but how
Mhm.
can you then still feel connected to them in your present life? And having some support, I think, can be helpful too. So when uh, those are just some ideas of a way to kind of that balance of approaching that loss, not avoiding, engaging in life, figuring out new meaning, and figuring out how to be connected with our loved one in your present life.
I think that's all great advice. Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious. I mean, this may not be something that you've studied, and so
Mhm.
push back on this, but we've gone through innumerable mass shootings, and the pandemic. I would imagine you'd put that in a similar bin in terms of like the
Mhm.
trauma that it's
Yeah.
caused. Have you done any research on how there's a collective building of anxiety and mental health issues in the country?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't directly researched that. I mean, but there is a term called collective trauma, which is the
Mhm.
term is the idea that a whole group of people, society of people that are going through the same similar traumatic event together collectively, and
Mhm.
it can impact all of us together, right? And then how we interact with each other. Everybody individually grieves very differently.
Mhm.
And then you have a whole group of people that may be grieving being impacted and interacting with one another. So it absolutely can impact whole large groups. I mean, even this pandemic, the rates of, the depression and anxiety have increased significantly, threefold and fourfold. And some CDC has been doing some ongoing tracking of US of Americans on their just screeners on anxiety and depression, and have seen compared since before the pandemic to now. And it's I believe now it's, before the pandemic, it was around 8 or 9% people reporting having some anxiety and depression. And now it's like 30%, right? So 1 in 3
Mhm.
people reporting some anxiety and depression symptoms. So I think it's a constellation of just the pandemic,
Mhm.
all the political divisiveness, increase in violence and mass violence incidents. I think it's just the context of all of it.
But if there was one good takeaway from everything you just said, it's that there are more conversations related to mental health now.
Yes.
And hopefully we can keep that
Yes,
information in our
yes,
back
yeah.
pocket.
Oh, well, I mean, I absolutely think that, it is definitely put mental health on the forefront. Healthcare providers' minds, on policymakers' minds, and which is, I think, helping then identify the problem and then trying to figure out what are better ways we can be doing to address it. Because really mental health is very underfunded and before and not really recognized and was very much a stigma. And now I think people are now having these conversations.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I feel like I've started to even talk to guys I've been friends with my whole life where, to us, mental health didn't exist until 3 years ago,
Right.
and so
Yeah.
it's changing relationships for the better, but still navigating and trying to figure out how we have these conversations,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think even in the younger generation, they're much more comfortable having these conversations, which is,
That's
I think, a
great.
really good thing too.
Yeah, that's very nice to hear. So when it comes to mass violence, you talked about the ripple effect and how important it is to see someone when you're feeling a certain way. What would you say to people who notice, depression or an anxiety in a friend? What would you tell them to do? What's the best way to approach them?
I just think reaching out and letting them know, hey, I care about you and I noticed some changes and,
Mhm.
just checking in, I think is really important.
Yeah,
Um, without judgment. So I just kind of just saying that, just let you know I care about you and I'm worried. I noticed you're not going out as much, or, I noticed you seem more irritable. So just kind of putting that out there, I think can be very helpful to
awesome.
start
Yeah.
that conversation.
Nice and simple too. You don't have to overthink it too much. Yeah, just
Right. Yes. No.
yeah.
No.
Absolutely. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I just want to check, is there anything you think I'm missing or anything that you'd like to mention about really anything that you do or mass violence or mental health, generally speaking?
One thing for me, at least, and when I talk to my kids about mass violence, because it can be very disheartening, right? When you see these things in the news and you see these events occurring, is to as much as you can pay attention. Yes, these are awful things that happen, and my heart goes out to communities, and also recognize that there are helpers. There's, whenever you see those images, you also usually see those first responders. You see those people going in and helping, and I think it's really important to recognize that there are great people out in this world, and that there are helpers that are there trying to do the good work of helping each other out. So those are the folks I try to focus on.
That's a great reminder. That's true. There's usually an absolute swarm of people ready
Mhm.
to help and bring food and whatever people need, right?
Yeah.
On and on and on. And that is always wonderful to see. It's like the best of us
Yes.
in
Yeah.
those moments. Yeah, that's a good reminder. I love that. Well, is there any social media or anything like that that you'd like to mention?
Yes, you can check us out at the National Mass Violence Victimization Resource Center. We are on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. We do have a podcast series as well. So if you're more interested in mass violence and from this conversation, you want to hear a little bit more from, we interview researchers and survivors and victim responders. So we got a neat podcast series. You can check us out there too. And then the last thing I do want to mention is for anybody that may have been impacted by a mass violence incident, we also have a self-help app called Transcend NMVC. The image is like a purple ball, but it's a free self-help app for anybody, any community member that's been impacted by a mass violence incident to help hopefully give you, a couple tools to kind of cope and manage. So that's available on both in Android and in the Apple Store.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for mentioning that. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. And
Thank you.
yeah,
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much to Alyssa. I know that, geez, it's just, I can't believe it's a subject that I'm cautiously choosing my words, and just because of the heaviness of the episode itself and the subject matter, of course. But like I said, it is great to know that there are people like Alyssa out there and her group, and hopefully, it sounds weird to say, hopefully Alyssa will be out of a job, in the sense that we put mass violence behind us, and of course she'd be able to move on. So before I get to the weird thing causing me anxiety this week, I just want to remind you of the Buy Me a Coffee link. It's just a way to make a donation to the show that help me keep making this. The Pure Spectrum CBD, with the promo code AnxietyPod for 15% off your orders. Instacart, if you want to sign up for home delivery of groceries, you can do that through the link in the description. By doing it that way, you're telling Instacart that this show sent you, which helps support the show. And then there's the Cardist Studio, who will also offer the promo code AnxietyPod for 15% off your first order. So yeah, check them out. Okay, the weird thing that's causing me anxiety this week and will likely be causing me anxiety for the foreseeable future is after more than a year being engaged, Jamie and I are actually starting to plan our wedding. You know, we took a break to buy the house and get the house settled, but now next focus is the wedding. So we're on to that, and there's just so many different details to go over and things to consider. And yeah, I'm already feeling overwhelmed between, day job, podcast, trying to exercise, drink water, get 8 hours of sleep. Right? This on top of that feels daunting. But at the end of the day, I'm marrying the woman I love, and it'll be great and exciting. Just want to get to that day intact. Well, as always, thank you so much for listening. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you on Thursday.